My name is Helen Brooks. I am 62 years old, a widow. And to most people, I look like a woman barely holding things together on a modest pension. They see my old sedan in the parking lot, the way I reuse grocery bags, and the simple apartment I go home to at night. People think they know the kind of life that means, but they don't. That is exactly how I planned it. For 15 years, I lived quietly behind that mask, moving through the world in plain sight but unseen. I let people assume I was ordinary, even struggling, because invisibility gave me peace. It protected my son, Daniel, from the weight of expectations and from people who might see him as a path to something else. But on the day of his wedding, at 3 p.m, one single moment shattered all of that. A sentence spoken across a crowded ballroom pulled my carefully built mask away. And that is where everything began to unravel. The Carter estate looked like something out of a magazine. Rolling hills stretched out in every direction, and their private chapel glowed with stained glass as the sun drifted lower in the sky. The reception that followed spilled into a ballroom filled with gold accents, chandeliers, and tables covered in flowers that seemed too perfect to be real. The kind of place where even the smallest detail whispered wealth. Daniel looked so happy that day, and for that alone, I was grateful. But standing in the back of that room, I felt the invisible lines that separated me from everyone else. Ava's gown shimmered with fabric that could have paid a teacher's salary for a year, and her parents walked with the confidence of people who believed the world had been made to fit them. I had chosen my simple navy dress on purpose, paired only with my grandmother's pearls. To anyone watching, I was exactly what they assumed I would be: the widow mother, careful, modest, and a little out of place among such glitter. I caught the polite smiles, the way some guests looked past me as though I belonged at the edges. They didn't mean to wound, but those little gestures felt like quiet reminders of where they believed I stood. I told myself I had learned to live in those shadows, but that evening, the shadows couldn't hold. Something was about to drag me into the center of the room, whether I wanted it or not. I had almost convinced myself the evening would pass quietly. Daniel and Ava danced their first dance, smiling like people at the very start of a perfect life. I stayed near the back, letting the music carry me, blending into the wallpaper the way I always had. For a moment, I believed invisibility would protect me one more time. But then Ava led her parents across the room and stopped in front of me. I could feel her eagerness, as if introducing me was another polished piece of the evening she wanted to control. I braced myself for polite small talk, but what came instead cracked the air wide open. Robert Carter turned toward me, and I saw the recognition flash in his face. His eyes narrowed in a way I knew too well, the way people look when puzzle pieces suddenly lock into place. In that instant, I understood he had connected me to a moment he had never forgotten. He knew. He remembered me not as Daniel's quiet mother, but as the woman who had sat across the acquisition table years earlier. The woman who had signed the papers that removed his company from his hands. I didn't need him to say the words aloud. I felt the ripple through the room, the way conversations dimmed, the way Ava's smile faltered. All those years of careful silence had been pierced in a single moment. For the first time in years, I was no longer invisible. And that realization forced me to look back, to remember exactly how I had ended up carrying a secret that large into my son's wedding day. To understand how I reached that ballroom carrying a secret worth more than almost anyone could imagine, you'd have to go back more than a decade. My late husband, Mark, and I were both engineers in our younger years. We met over long shifts at a tech company in Austin, building small things we hoped would someday matter. Mark had a restless mind, always tinkering after hours, scribbling notes on napkins, chasing solutions to problems most people didn't even notice. In 2010, he finally cracked one. It was a design for a power system that allowed cell phone batteries to last significantly longer without increasing their size. At the time, it felt like a modest achievement, something that might give us a cushion for retirement. But when we sold the patent in 2012, the check that arrived stunned us both. $25 million. I remember staring at that number as if it had come from another planet. From the very beginning, Mark and I agreed on one thing. Daniel didn't need to know the size of it. He was 24, just out of graduate school, excited to build his own career in marketing. We told him we had secured enough to live comfortably, but nothing extravagant. We wanted his choices to be his own, not shaped by money he hadn't earned. With the fortune in hand, Mark and I studied relentlessly. At first, we kept to safe investments, but slowly we expanded growth stocks, real estate, early technology firms. Mark had a rare instinct for value, and I balanced his boldness with my discipline. Together, we built a portfolio that doubled, then tripled. When Mark passed away suddenly in 2020, the grief nearly swallowed me. Yet there I was, left with memories, with loss, and with a portfolio worth more than $700 million. I carried on, because it was the only way I knew to honor him. By 2023, the fortune had grown close to $1 billion. Numbers so large they hardly felt real. But every dollar was tied to nights of research, discipline, and patience. And still, the world believed I was just a widow stretching a pension check. That was exactly what I wanted them to believe, until the Carters saw through the mask. Living modestly was never about lack. It was about freedom. I learned quickly that the easiest way to protect a secret was to let people underestimate you. If they saw an old car, they assumed I couldn't afford better. If they noticed the same coat worn winter after winter, they thought I was simply frugal. They built their own story about me, and I let them. In their eyes, I was safe, unremarkable, invisible. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when people offered pity disguised as kindness, speaking as though I might need Daniel's support once I grew older. Even Ava, long before the wedding, had asked me casual questions about retirement, about whether I worried Daniel would have to step in one day. I smiled. I gave her nothing, but I remembered. Some people see invisibility as weakness. For me, it was strategy. I wanted Daniel's life measured by his choices, not by a shadow of wealth hanging over him. And I wanted the space to move quietly, to decide without others crowding in with their judgments. But invisibility has its limits. That night at the wedding, I could feel the shift in Ava's eyes. What had once been indifference turned into calculation. And that was when I knew the real test was still to come. A few days after the wedding, Ava invited Daniel and me to lunch at one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. Daniel thought it was a kind gesture, a way for her to build a bridge between us. But as soon as I walked in, I knew it was something else. The wine she had chosen was already waiting on the table, a vintage that cost more than most families' rent. Her suit looked like it had been pulled straight from a business magazine. Nothing about it felt casual. I sat across from her and listened as she laid out her vision. She spoke about family, about building a future together, about pooling resources into what she called a family trust. She painted it as philanthropy, as security, as legacy. But underneath her polished words, I heard something different. It wasn't about generosity or unity. It was about control. Equal votes among trustees, she said. Daniel, Ava and me, I knew what that really meant. She wanted leverage. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, caught between loyalty and uncertainty. I could feel his eyes searching mine, hoping for reassurance. But I stayed quiet, swirling the wine in my glass as if the entire proposal were nothing more than dinner conversation. Inside, though, I felt the first flicker of warning. Ava was not simply curious about who I was. She was reaching. She had done her homework, and she was laying the groundwork for something larger. I didn't argue. I didn't reveal what I knew. I simply left that lunch knowing one thing: if Ava thought she could corner me. She hadn't yet seen the game I had been playing for years, and that was when I decided to investigate. The moment I left that restaurant, I knew I couldn't afford to dismiss what had just happened. Ava's proposal had been too polished, too carefully rehearsed. She wasn't speaking from impulse, she was unveiling a plan, and if she had prepared documents for a casual lunch, then she had already taken steps behind the scenes. I called Michael Grant, the advisor who had stood by Mark and me for years. He was more than an advisor. He was someone I trusted with every detail of our journey. I told him what had unfolded and asked him to dig quietly. Not just into the Carter family's finances, but into Ava's movements since the engagement. The report he returned with was heavier than I expected. Their estate, so breathtaking from the outside, was mortgaged nearly to its limits. Their investment accounts had been drained to maintain appearances. Most of Robert Carter's income came from consulting arrangements quietly arranged by the very management I had put in place when I purchased his company years ago. But what struck me hardest was Ava's activity. In the weeks before the wedding, she had opened new lines of credit. She had paid a private investigator, one known for tracing hidden assets. She had made inquiries with estate lawyers who specialized in family disputes. It became clear Ava wasn't just curious about me. She was already building a case, preparing for the day when she thought she could corner me. She didn't know it yet, but I had been playing a longer, quieter game than she could imagine. And soon, she would find out what that really meant. 2 weeks later, the Carters invited me to a meeting at Robert's downtown office. They dressed it up as a family discussion, but I recognized the stage the moment I walked in. A polished oak table, bottled water lined perfectly, folders stacked in the center. Everything about it screamed negotiation, not family. Ava sat beside Daniel with her posture sharpened, her parents across from me, and a lawyer waiting to begin. They talked about fairness, about transparency, about building something extraordinary together. Then came the number. They believed a contribution of $15,000 from me would be the right start for this so-called family trust. I didn't even open the folder they slid across the table. Instead, I placed my own folder down. Inside were copies of Ava's new credit lines, her payments to a private investigator, her inquiries with an estate law firm. I let the silence settle. I didn't need to raise my voice. They all saw what it meant. Ava had been busy preparing her move, expecting to pay back her debts once she gained access to mine. That was when I made my decision. I told them they had 2 options. They could withdraw every investigation, every attempt to interfere in my affairs, or they could watch this escalate in ways they weren't prepared for. And then I offered something no one expected, a single payment of $5,000. No strings, no discussions. But in exchange, Ava would walk away and never contact me or Daniel again. It wasn't generosity, it was clarity. If she had married for love, money wouldn't matter. If she had married for access, then the money would tempt her. Either way, the truth would come out. The silence that followed was heavier than any boardroom I had ever known. A few days later, I received my answer. Ava accepted. She took the $5,000 and signed the paperwork that severed her from our lives. On paper, the matter was finished. In reality, the wound was only beginning. Daniel filed for divorce soon after. He couldn't reconcile the betrayal, the realization that the woman he had trusted most had been building a case against his own mother. I saw the pain in his eyes, the way his shoulders carried a weight he hadn't expected to bear so early in his marriage. It aged him overnight. But his hurt wasn't only about Ava. It was about me. For 15 years, I had hidden the truth, and now that secret stood between us like a wall. He told me he felt deceived, that his whole life had been shaped beside a shadow I never acknowledged. I didn't defend myself. I didn't try to justify the choices. Sometimes explanations sound like excuses, and I wanted him to have space to feel what he needed to feel. Those weeks were the hardest for me. Winning against Ava had cost me peace with my son. And while I had always believed invisibility was my greatest shield, I realized now it had also been a barrier between me and the person I loved most. But time has a way of softening the sharpest edges. Slowly, there was a shift, a possibility that healing could come, if only we allowed it. When the divorce was finalized and the noise began to fade, I realized I couldn't keep living in the apartment where Mark and I had built our life. The walls carried too many memories, too many layers of silence. So I sold it, packed what mattered, and moved to Santa Fe. Santa Fe had always called to me. The desert sky stretched wide and unbroken, the air felt lighter, and the rhythm of life moved slower, calmer. No one there looked at me as a mysterious investor or a widow guarding her fortune. I was simply Helen, a woman in her 60s who liked to walk through the farmer's market and talk to local artists about their work. For the first time in years, I felt unburdened, but I also knew I wanted to give meaning to the years of discipline and sacrifice. That's when I created the Mark Fund, named in honor of my husband. It was designed for young engineers from working-class families who had big ideas but lacked the resources to bring them to life. Watching those students present projects full of hope gave me more joy than any profit margin ever could. For once, my wealth wasn't hidden in portfolios or measured in balance sheets. It was alive in the hands of people chasing possibility. And in that choice, I found peace I hadn't known I was missing. Still, as fulfilling as this new chapter was, the greatest healing came not from money or legacy, but from Daniel himself. Time did what time always does, it softened what once felt unbearable. Daniel slowly found his footing again. Months after the divorce, he introduced me to someone new. Her name was Claire, a school teacher with kind eyes and a laugh that filled a room without effort. What struck me most was her simplicity. When Daniel told her about me, that I lived modestly, that I drove an old sedan, she smiled as though it was the most natural thing in the world. There was no calculation, no flicker of judgment, just a sense that priorities mattered more than appearances. Watching them together reminded me of what I had always hoped Daniel would find. Not someone dazzled by chandeliers or expensive wine, but someone who valued honesty, laughter, and the kind of comfort that can't be bought. That Christmas, our table finally felt whole again. Cocoa steaming in mugs, carols sung off key, and laughter that was genuine. For the first time in years, peace sat with us at the table. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see in the middle of it all. Real revenge was never about exposing Ava or humiliating her family. It wasn't about winning a battle in some boardroom or proving I had more money than anyone guessed. Real revenge was peace. It was choosing to thrive without their shadows over my life, and teaching Daniel that wealth means little without integrity. For years, I believed hiding behind modesty was the only way to keep him safe, and in some ways, it worked. But the truth is, boundaries matter more than invisibility. When you don't set them, someone else will set them for you, and they will never protect your heart the way you would. The greatest gift I could leave wasn't the billion-dollar portfolio or the scholarships my fund provides. It was resilience. It was the reminder that even in the face of betrayal, we get to decide who we become. If you've ever felt underestimated, or if you've had to draw a line to protect someone you love, then you already know what I mean. Quiet can be power. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment about the boundaries you've had to set in your own family. And if you believe peace is the best kind of wealth, let me know by liking this video. Because at the end of the day, the richest life is the one you can live honestly, with presence and with peace.